On March 18, 2010, the Commonwealth of Virginia carried out the execution of Paul Warner Powell, a man whose case would come to symbolize both the horror of violent crime and the rare moment when justice got a second chance. At just 31 years old, Powell was put to death by lethal injection. But years earlier, he had been so confident he had escaped capital punishment that he mocked the system, writing graphic, unapologetic letters to prosecutors that detailed the very acts he thought they couldn't prove. It all began with the murder of 16-year-old Stacie Reed and the attempted murder of her 14-year-old sister, Kristie. And her testimony, combined with Powell's own chilling admissions, eventually led to his downfall. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a true crime investigation like this. Paul Warner Powell was born on April 13, 1978, in Virginia, and from an early age, those who knew him described him as a deeply troubled individual, someone with an unpredictable temper, a disdain for authority, and a toxic worldview shaped by hatred and bigotry. He grew up exhibiting signs of antisocial behavior, often getting into fights, challenging teachers, and showing little regard for consequences. As a teenager, Powell's personality became more volatile. He gravitated toward white supremacist ideologies, openly expressing racist beliefs and aligning himself with extremist groups and music that promoted hatred and violence. He wasn't quiet about his views. He often wore white power symbols, spoke about racial superiority, and kept journals and writings that mirrored the rhetoric of hate groups. His attitude isolated him from many peers, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he leaned further into that identity, finding pride in his rejection of social norms and decency. Amid this growing radicalization, Powell became fixated on a girl named Stacie Reed, a smart, athletic, and kind 16-year-old who lived in Manassas, Virginia. He met her through her younger sister, Kristie, who was just 14 at the time. Though Powell was older, he hung around the Reed sisters enough to gain access to their home and to observe their routines. Stacie was, by all accounts, everything Powell was not: hopeful, well-liked, and on a positive path. But what began as an unhealthy interest quickly evolved into an obsession. Powell became jealous and possessive over Stacie, despite the fact that there was never a romantic relationship between them. His obsession turned dark when he learned something that, in his own racist and twisted mind, pushed him over the edge: Stacie was dating a black male. According to later court records and Powell's own writings, this revelation set him off, igniting a dangerous mixture of rage, hatred, and entitlement. He viewed her relationship as a betrayal not just of his feelings, but of his racist beliefs, and he began plotting a confrontation. The fact that she was choosing someone he despised based solely on race became, in his view, a justification for violence. Powell's hatred wasn't just personal, it was ideological, and he allowed that hatred to grow until it consumed his judgment entirely. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Powell's behavior became more aggressive and erratic. He expressed violent thoughts in conversations, made veiled threats, and carried a deep resentment toward Stacie for defying him. Instead of walking away or confronting his own biases, Powell planned an act so brutal and calculated that it would leave a family shattered and a community stunned. On the afternoon of January 29, 1999, the Reed family home in Manassas, Virginia, became the site of a devastating tragedy. Inside that house, Paul Warner Powell carried out a violent act that would not only claim the life of one teenage girl but nearly take the life of another. At some point after Stacie Reed returned home from school that day, Powell confronted her. The situation quickly turned hostile, and during a brief, intense altercation, he attacked her with a knife. Stacie was critically wounded in the encounter and died shortly thereafter inside the family home. She was only 16 years old. Rather than leave the scene immediately, Powell stayed inside the house. Calm and composed, he waited. A short time later, Stacie's younger sister, 14-year-old Kristie Reed, arrived home, unaware of the danger she was walking into. Upon entering, she was confronted by Powell and coerced upstairs under false pretenses. There, in the same house where her sister had just lost her life, Kristie became the victim of a terrifying assault. Afterward, Powell attempted to end Kristie's life as well, believing he had silenced both sisters. He then fled the scene. But in an act of immense courage and resilience, Kristie, though severely injured, managed to call 911. That call set in motion a swift response by local authorities and emergency personnel. Paramedics arrived to find one sister tragically deceased and the other critically wounded, but alive. Kristie was immediately transported to the hospital, where medical teams worked urgently to save her life. Despite her condition, she was able to give investigators the name of her attacker, Paul Warner Powell. Her statement became a crucial lead in the investigation. As officers examined the home, they found evidence of a violent and targeted crime. What had occurred wasn't random, it was intentional and deeply personal. The courage Kristie showed that day, both in surviving and in speaking out, became the foundation of a case that would stretch across years in courtrooms and ultimately bring Powell to justice. Her strength, in the face of unimaginable fear, ensured the truth would be heard. And this was just the beginning. In the days that followed Kristie Reed's harrowing survival and the discovery of her sister's body, police moved quickly. With Kristie's powerful statement identifying Paul Warner Powell as the attacker, law enforcement wasted no time in locating and arresting him. Powell, showing little emotion during his arrest, was taken into custody without incident. What followed would become the beginning of a long, complex legal process, one that would take more than a decade to fully unfold. In 2000, just a year after the attack, Powell was brought to trial in Prince William County, Virginia. The charges were as severe as the crime itself: capital murder for the killing of Stacie Reed, rape and attempted capital murder for the assault on Kristie, and several related charges involving abduction and use of a deadly weapon. The prosecution painted a clear and chilling picture. This was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned and deliberately executed series of crimes carried out by a man fueled by jealousy, anger, and control. Kristie Reed, still only a teenager, displayed remarkable courage by testifying in court, reliving her trauma in front of a courtroom packed with attorneys, press, and members of the public. She described in painful detail how Powell had lured her upstairs, assaulted her, and then tried to kill her. Her voice, though young, carried the weight of truth and heartbreak, and her testimony moved many to tears. She was the beating heart of the prosecution's case, and the living proof that Powell had not succeeded in silencing both sisters. The jury heard about Powell's background, his obsessive interest in Stacie, his growing anger in the weeks before the crime, and his lack of remorse afterward. Forensic evidence matched the scene with Powell's presence, and his behavior following the attack suggested a man who not only committed the crime but believed he could walk away from it. The defense struggled to counter the evidence. They did not deny Powell's involvement but tried to focus on the idea that the murder may not have been premeditated or that there was insufficient evidence to meet the legal threshold for capital murder, an argument that would later take center stage in the appeals process. After days of testimony, including Kristie's unforgettable account and the grim forensic evidence presented by investigators, the jury found Powell guilty on all major charges. In the sentencing phase, the prosecution sought the ultimate punishment, death, arguing that Powell had shown no remorse and that the nature of the crime warranted no lesser sentence. The jury agreed. In 2000, Paul Warner Powell was sentenced to death for the murder of Stacie Reed and the attempted murder and assault of Kristie Reed. For many, it felt like justice had been served. A dangerous man had been held accountable, and the Reed family could finally begin the difficult process of healing. But justice, as it turned out, was not yet finished with Paul Warner Powell. Because just 1 year later, in a dramatic turn of events, the Virginia Supreme Court overturned Powell's death sentence, ruling that while he was guilty of murder, the prosecution had failed to sufficiently prove that Stacie Reed had been sexually assaulted or that Powell had attempted to do so prior to her death, a critical element required under Virginia law at the time to justify a capital murder conviction. The court reduced Powell's sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Reed family, it was a devastating blow. The man who had taken their daughter, who had nearly killed another, and who had shown no remorse, was now spared the fate the jury had chosen for him. The feeling of closure had been ripped away. But this story was far from over. Because Paul Warner Powell was about to make a mistake, one so bold, so arrogant, and so unthinkable, that it would open the door to a second chance at justice and ultimately his own undoing. After the Virginia Supreme Court overturned his death sentence in 2001, Paul Warner Powell was reclassified as a life inmate. He had escaped execution, at least for the moment. He was transferred to a maximum security prison, where he began serving a life sentence for first-degree murder and additional time for the assault and attempted murder of Kristie Reed. For most people, life behind bars would be a time of reflection, of silence, of fading into obscurity. But Paul Warner Powell was not like most people. Rather than remain quiet and accept his fate, Powell did something no one could have predicted. He began to write letters. Not to friends. Not to family. But to the lead prosecutor, Commonwealth's attorney Paul Ebert, the same man who had fought to have him sentenced to death just a year earlier. These were not apologies. They were not appeals for leniency. They were taunts, letters laced with contempt, sarcasm, and most disturbingly, full confessions to the very acts the prosecution had struggled to prove the first time around. One of the most infamous letters arrived in Ebert's office in late 2001. In it, Powell mocked the court's decision to spare his life and openly boasted about what he had done to Stacie Reed. "Since I have already been tried and found not guilty of the murder and attempted rape of Stacie, I can't be tried again. So let me tell you what really happened." And he did. In shocking, explicit detail, Powell described how he had intended to rape Stacie before killing her, how he had attacked her in anger, how she fought back, and how he ultimately stabbed her to death. He even added, "I would have raped her, but she wouldn't stop fighting me." With those words, Powell revealed something that had never been confirmed in the original trial, that he intended to sexually assault Stacie before killing her, which, under Virginia law, would qualify the murder as capital, the very distinction that had been missing the first time around. He even acknowledged the knife wound in her chest and his calm demeanor afterward, stating in one letter, "I can't believe I left the knife in her neck." It was the legal equivalent of setting himself on fire, and he didn't stop with one letter. Over the course of several months, Powell wrote multiple letters, each one confirming his intentions, ridiculing the justice system, and daring prosecutors to act. He believed, wrongly, that double jeopardy laws protected him from being tried again for the same crime. In his mind he had outsmarted the system, and now he was rubbing it in. But what Powell failed to understand was this: the first trial had not established all the elements of capital murder. His new confessions introduced previously unproven facts, creating a legally valid path to retry him on enhanced charges. Prosecutors moved quickly. With the letters as direct evidence, and the crime now meeting the legal criteria for capital murder based on attempted sexual assault, they re-indicted Powell in 2003. This time there was no doubt. His own words, typed with arrogance, sealed with pride, and sent through the prison mail system, would become the very rope used to pull him back toward the death penalty. When asked later why Powell would confess so openly, prosecutors and legal experts speculated that it was a mix of defiance and ignorance. A man who thought he had nothing left to lose and was too prideful to keep quiet. But his miscalculation gave the Commonwealth something rare: a second chance at justice. And for Kristie Reed, who had survived the attack and watched the justice system waver, it meant that her sister might finally be honored with the full weight of accountability. The man who had tried to silence her was now the one giving her voice more power than ever before. Paul Warner Powell had spoken, and the system was ready to respond. In 2003, armed with Powell's own written confessions and a renewed determination to seek justice, prosecutors filed new charges, this time under the correct legal foundation. The charge: capital murder with attempted rape as the aggravating factor, the exact element that had been missing during his first conviction and had led to the reversal of his death sentence. The legal justification was solid. While double jeopardy prohibits someone from being tried twice for the same exact offense, the courts determined that Powell's confessions introduced new evidence, crucial facts that had not been known or proven during the first trial. His arrogance had exposed him to fresh legal peril. What he had assumed was a legal shield had now become a gateway to his retrial. The Commonwealth of Virginia began preparing its case with renewed energy. This time, the prosecution didn't need to infer Powell's intent or speculate on what might have happened inside the Reed home that day. They had Powell's own words. His letters detailed not only his mindset before the attack, but also his actions during and after. They removed all ambiguity. And in a capital case, clarity can mean everything. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Paul Warner Powell sat once again at the defense table, this time with less of the smirking confidence he had shown before. Across from him sat Kristie Reed, now older, stronger, and no longer the terrified 14-year-old who had survived one of the most brutal attacks imaginable. Once again she took the witness stand. And once again she described the nightmare she had endured, this time knowing that the man who tried to kill her had done himself in. The jury listened as the prosecution read excerpts from Powell's letters aloud. The words were cold, calculated, and disturbingly casual. Powell spoke of Stacie's final moments, of Kristie's suffering, and of his own indifference. Jurors, some visibly shaken, listened as the killer effectively confessed to every element of capital murder. To strengthen their case further, prosecutors introduced forensic testimony, timeline evidence, and medical reports that supported the details Kristie had testified to years earlier, details now chillingly echoed in Powell's own admissions. There was no defense strong enough to undo what Powell had written. No explanation. No apology. No plausible claim that his words were misinterpreted. When it was the defense's turn to argue, there was little to stand on. Powell didn't testify. The jury deliberated for only a short time. The verdict, guilty. Again. This time, unquestionably. And once more Powell was sentenced to death, but this time the ruling stood. The retrial sent a powerful message, not just to Powell but to anyone who thought they could manipulate the justice system with technicalities or hubris. It was a rare moment where justice got a second chance and made it count. For the Reed family, and especially Kristie, it was another step in a long journey. But it was a meaningful one. The man who had tried to take everything from them had, in the end, given them the very tool to bring about his own punishment. Paul Warner Powell was once again headed for death row. After his second death sentence in 2003, Paul Warner Powell was transferred to Virginia's death row at Sussex State Prison, a stark, isolated facility reserved for the Commonwealth's most dangerous offenders. He now lived in a small concrete cell under constant surveillance, with limited privileges and the ticking clock of capital punishment echoing through each day. Despite the weight of his sentence, Powell showed no remorse. He never issued an apology to the Reed family. He never expressed regret for taking the life of a promising teenager or for nearly ending another. Instead, he continued writing letters from behind bars, occasionally communicating with media and legal contacts, often with the same blunt tone that had defined his earlier confessions. His legal team continued filing appeals, but the court stood firm. The evidence, his own words, Kristie's testimony, and the physical facts, were undeniable. Over time, the public and legal interest in the case waned, but for the Reed family the pain never truly faded. They waited, for closure, for justice, for the end. And in 2010 it finally came. After nearly a decade on death row, the final chapter of Paul Warner Powell's life was coming to an end. The lengthy appeals process had been exhausted. His conviction had withstood multiple legal challenges, and the courts had affirmed, again and again, that his sentence was lawful, appropriate, and final. On March 18, 2010, Powell was moved from Sussex State Prison to the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia, where the Commonwealth carried out its executions. In the final 24 hours of his life, Powell was placed under heightened observation. A team of corrections officers monitored him closely as state protocols were followed with quiet precision. As with all executions in Virginia, Powell was offered a last meal, a tradition that often draws public curiosity. His request reflected no symbolism or sentimentality. He ordered a simple hearty spread: pepperoni pizza, fried chicken, chocolate cake, and grape soda. He ate it without comment. Those final hours were spent in isolation. No family members visited him. There were no public statements from relatives, no pleas for clemency, no vigil from loved ones. Powell chose not to offer a final written statement to the press. His silence in those final hours stood in contrast to the defiant voice he had once used so brazenly to boast about his crimes. Shortly before 9 p.m., he was led to the death chamber, a small, sterile room with white walls and a heavy glass observation window. Witnesses gathered quietly on the other side, a small group of prison officials, journalists, and representatives of the victim's family. The mood was solemn, still, and heavy. Powell was secured to the gurney. An IV line was inserted. Moments before the lethal injection began, he was given the opportunity to speak final words. He spoke calmly, saying, "I have made peace with God. I have no fear. I'm going to a better place." They were words meant perhaps to bring himself comfort, but for many watching, they rang hollow. At 9:09 p.m., Paul Warner Powell was pronounced dead. He was 31 years old. For the Reed family, his execution marked the end of a long and deeply painful chapter. More than 11 years after he shattered their lives. While no punishment could ever bring Stacie back, justice, delayed though it was, had finally run its course. There were no celebrations, no cheers. Only the quiet, enduring grief of a family who had lived with loss, trauma, and the long shadows of what happened in their home that winter afternoon. And through it all, one survivor remained: Kristie Reed. The girl who had lived, testified, and stood strong through 2 trials and more than a decade of painful memories. Her strength ensured that the world never forgot what Paul Warner Powell tried to silence, and her courage helped deliver justice not just once but twice. This case reminds us that while evil may sometimes slip through the cracks, the truth has a way of resurfacing. And when it does, courage like Kristie's ensures it cannot be ignored. What do you think about this case? Was justice truly served, or is there more to reflect on? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories told with depth, accuracy, and respect. See you on our next video.